Welcome to Good Nintentions Episode 2, where we meet the game that taught NES owners the meaning of love. Baseball may have been the oldest piece of software to debut alongside the NES in October 1985, but it wasn't actually the first NES game to reach America. That honor belongs to tennis, which according to Nintendo's promotional materials actually showed up in the US a year and a half before the NES did. Nintendo spent quite a lot of time developing a strategy for the US launch of the NES. The Famicom had arrived in Japan right as the American console game retail market imploded under the weight of too many terrible video games, mainly for the unregulated Atari 2600. It was a mess all around, as the flood of trash games for 2600 meant that good games had a hard time standing out from the bad, which turned off consumers, which meant retailers were left with tons of unsold stock, which meant everyone lost money. Nintendo wanted to export the Famicom to America almost immediately, but the universal message they received from everyone stateside was, yeah, don't bother. Undeterred, Nintendo took the long view, experimenting with different console designs, names, and marketing strategies in order to appeal to US retailers. Meanwhile, they stealthily conducted tests in the American market by putting Famicom games in front of arcade-goers. The Nintendo Versus system was a series of low-cost arcade cabinets and conversion kits, which presented a fairly revolutionary design concept. Not only could arcade operators cheaply buy a Versus system conversion kit for their existing Nintendo machines to paste over Donkey Kong 3 after it stopped earning money a few weeks after its debut, but they could also continue buying new, interchangeable Versus boards to keep the machines fresh for relatively little cost. Rather than have to buy an entirely new machine every time they wanted to refresh their collection, Versus system owners could simply plug in a new board and add on fresh side and marquee art for considerably less cost than buying an entirely new cabinet. It was a simple, clever idea, and one that came naturally. After all, the Versus system was basically just a Famicom, which itself had been designed to play interchangeable games. A Versus system plug-in board was, in effect, a Famicom hardware board with a cartridge built in. Since the console was pretty much state-of-the-art when it debuted in 1984, it compared favorably with current arcade systems. No, it wasn't quite as powerful as the best games the coin-op industry had to offer, but it's easy to forget when looking back at the greats of the era that most games from most publishers were absolutely not on par with something like Xevious or Dragon's Lair. No, most arcade releases were actually really terrible and primitive, which is why you don't remember them. The Versus system wasn't top of the line, but it definitely offered an above-average gaming experience. And arcade fans responded to Nintendo's gambit favorably, making the Versus system a consistent moneymaker for both operators and for Nintendo. The success of this low-cost arcade venture fueled Nintendo's conviction to forge ahead with US launch plans for the NES, regardless of the market's collective gloom. It obviously went well for them. Tennis made perfect sense as the choice for the Versus system's pilot program. For starters, it was one of Nintendo's newest pieces of software. The Famicom game debuted in Japan in January 1984, just 2 months before the date Nintendo gives as the US launch of the Versus system. I doubt anyone realized it at the time, but anyone privy to the rollout of the Versus system was experiencing the cutting edge of home video game software. Of course, the other thing working in tennis's favor is that while it was cutting edge, it also was the most mature and established video game concept in the world. For all intents and purposes, video games got their start with tennis. William Higginbotham created what is widely regarded as the first video game ever with 1958's Tennis for Two, a rudimentary two-player competitive game played on an oscilloscope. While barely playable and certainly a long way from what we think of as video games today, Tennis for Two established the entire concept of using a computer for interactive and competitive entertainment. Less than 15 years later, after being briefly distracted by a couple of space-based shoot-'em-ups, video games took proper form when Atari created PONG, a table tennis game. PONG became the baseline of video games throughout the 1970s. The medium quickly expanded into racing, shooting, and other sports, but it seemed like any serious publisher had a PONG clone in their catalog somewhere. Certainly Nintendo did. Its earliest foray into the home gaming market took the form of a series of dedicated TV consoles called the Color TV game. Naturally, the first two entries in the Color TV game series were PONG clones that offered first 6 and then 15 variants of the venerable game. The color TV game project was led by none other than NES hardware designer Masayuki Uemura, whose experience with these early devices helped shape the direction of the NES. In other words, the entire tennis concept was built into the NES's DNA right from the start. So it seems perfectly fitting that Americans' first taste of the NES came in the form of tennis. Of course, NES Tennis looked a far sight more sophisticated than Pong. Detailed cartoonish humans replaced the rectangular paddles, an authentic-looking court replaced Pong's blank background. It even featured a referee overlooking the action, Mario's very first NES cameo. While incredibly simplistic by current standards, Nintendo's tennis captures the basic of the sport quite effectively. It features several different play modes and multiple difficulty settings, which alter the speed of the game and the effectiveness of the artificial intelligence. At maximum difficulty, the computer turns a devilish red and basically annihilates human players before they can even blink. You're not just limited to AI play though. In addition to solo play, you could team up for a doubles match against the computer. In 1984, Nintendo's tennis definitely represented the state of the art in computer tennis games. There weren't actually all that many tennis games on the market at the time, perhaps due to Pong fatigue, and each new release represented a small improvement over the fundamental Pong concept. 1980s tennis, for Intellivision, took the basic Pong concept and retained the left-right court orientation, while adding some rudimentary graphics and a few mechanical enhancements. The ball obeyed simple physics, including the possibility of a net, and players could move forward and backward in addition to up and down. Activision's tennis, for Atari 2600, took the next step by rotating the court 90 degrees, using a forced perspective that changed the orientation of the action considerably. Activision's design applied a simple 3D perspective to the court, so that its boundaries converged to a distant vanishing point, and the front court, the one used by player 1, appeared larger than the back court. 2 years later, in 1983, the genre received a massive boost with Data East's arcade title, Super Doubles Tennis. It's Super Doubles Tennis from which Nintendo presumably took its inspiration for NES Tennis, as the two games are almost suspiciously similar. Data East's game tilted the visual perspective even further than Activision's did, making the forecourt much larger for players. It also attempted to add some rudimentary perspective to the rest of the visuals, making the players' characters larger than the competitors in the back court. And finally, the ball itself changed size to reflect its motion and location relative to the player. As it rose or came into the foreground, it grew. As it touched the court or moved into the back of the playing space, it appeared smaller. To be honest, Nintendo's tennis does very little to add to Super Doubles Tennis. Not only does it borrow every visual trick wholesale, it even shamelessly sticks the line judge in the same place. What tennis does offer over Super Doubles Tennis, however, is refinement. Data East may have come up with an attractive, convincing visual presentation, but Nintendo perfected it. Nintendo's tennis features vastly more attractive characters than the ones in Super Doubles Tennis. They're rendered in a much nicer art style. The same cartoonish look that characterized baseball shows up here, and it brings with it the same wonderful level of detail. Player characters are nicely drawn and smoothly animated, scrambling fluidly around the court, and swatting at the ball with graceful swings. The visual perspective on the fore and back court looks a whole lot more convincing as well. You no longer appear to control a pair of NBA All-Stars against a couple of fat children. The foreground players and their opponents appear to be much more in proportion to one another here. More importantly, the ball animates much more convincingly than in Super Doubles Tennis. The ball moves back and forth over the net more authentically here, and as it bounces between rackets, it appears to grow and shrink in a more visually correct manner. It's a subtle difference, but there's a greater sense of realism and consistency to Nintendo's animations that actually affects how the game plays, even more so than the similar animation in baseball, making this tennis game more playable and fun. Tennis closely follows the rules of the game, up to and including the inclusion of full 3-match play. A full one-on-one session of tennis can take the better part of an hour, which definitely sets the game apart from its arcade forebears, which were designed for quick quarter drops. Of course, the adjustable difficulty settings can affect game speed. On the easiest setting, a seasoned player can make short work of the CPU, while the exact reverse holds true for higher difficulty levels. Play the game at a difficulty level on par with your skills, however, and you'll find that tennis does a nice job of giving you a difficult but not impossible game. As with baseball, the AI is neither moronic nor unreasonably skilled. The computer will occasionally appear to flub a return on purpose, but that's probably just the game's way of making up for the fact that the computer has some subtle invisible advantages. For one thing, despite all the graphical embellishments on display here, it can still be difficult to judge your precise relationship to the ball, a problem the CPU never has. You also seem to have very little control over where the ball goes. In my experience, it almost always veers in the same direction, no matter how I approach it, meaning a sustained volley inevitably ends with you hitting out of bounds as you creep along ever closer to the penalty line. The other significant flaw in tennis is that the visual perspective essentially makes one-on-one play impossible. Because the backcourt is so much smaller than the foreground, a player stuck back there would be at a massive disadvantage, with much less space and pixel information to work with. So tennis simply removes the head-to-head option altogether. Two-player tennis consists of doubles only. It's an unfortunate compromise, but one Nintendo made in exchange for great visual presentation. And if indeed this game was patterned after Super Doubles Tennis, as it appears to have been, it was a conscious and established design choice. While tennis as a sport has come a long way in terms of video game presentation over the past 30 years, NES tennis holds up pretty well. There is, after all, only so much you can do with a real-world sport whose basic format is simple enough that it could be distilled down to serve as the topic of the world's first video game. In fact, Nintendo's latest follow-up to tennis, Mario Tennis Ultra Smash, arrives this week on Wii U, and it uses the same general format as the NES game. While it has plenty of new features, most of those are novelty modes, weird court layouts, or special challenges. As far as the basic game goes, however, tennis nailed it pretty well way back in 1984, even without amiibo support. It introduced America to the NES in fine style, and in the process, taught a lot of very confused children about how the rules of the game work. Next time on Good Nintentions, programming legend Satoru Iwata makes his American debut.